Welcome to AskPsychSesions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/AskPsychSesions. That's bit.ly/AskPsychSesions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thank you for joining us. Today I have in studio 3 guests. We have authors of 2 brand new books that I thought would be of interest to our listeners. And these books are called Teaching Diversity Relationally, Engaging Emotions and Embracing Possibilities, as well as Unraveling Assumptions, a primer for understanding oppression and privilege. And our authors today, we have one repeat guest, Dr. Roxanne Donovan, who is at Kennesaw State University. And then new to the podcast are Dr. Grace Kim, who is in the Department of Counseling Psychology and Applied Human Development at Boston University, and Karen Suyemoto, who is a professor of psychology and affiliate in Asian American Studies and Critical Ethnic and Community Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I want to thank all 3 of you for joining me today. It's good to have you here.
Great being here.
Thanks for having us.
You are welcome. So to kick us off, because we have a lot that we can potentially cover, maybe if we could hear from our first authors, so first from Grace and then from Karen, it's up to you. Do you want to give a quick summation of the book or a little background information about why this book is an important book, or if people are only going to read one book this summer, it should be 2 because they go together. But why start with yours? So Grace, take it away, please.
Thank you, Marianne. I'll talk a little bit about the Teaching Diversity Relationally. And this is a book that provides the readers some process-oriented guidance for how to think about psychological and relational challenges that is embedded in teaching about race, privilege, and oppression, and other challenging topics. And as we all know, teaching about these topics is really challenging. And also often that this is an area that we don't have a lot of training in. So most educators learn on the job. And we really wanted to think about how to effectively do this using our psychological knowledge. So all 3 of us are trained in clinical psychology, and we wanted to kind of think about not only just the content of what we're teaching, but also the pedagogy and process piece of what we're teaching. So we pay a lot of attention to what students are bringing, both internally, interpersonally, and also when they're all together, what may happen in group dynamics, and also what faculty are bringing as well. So using various psychological theories, we really explain some aspects of how do we create a space where effective teaching about social justice and diversity is possible. So that's what we are really aiming to do through this book. So I'll pause there.
Great. Thank you. Lots to jump in for there, but there's a whole other book to talk about. So Karen, what can you tell us about Unraveling Assumptions, a primer for understanding oppression and privilege?
Thanks, Marianne. When we started talking about writing a book on teaching, and the ways that we taught about race and we taught about oppression, and how we brought in our understanding of students as whole people and the interactions between them, and kind of the psychological processes that were unfolding as students learned about race and struggled with these really difficult concepts, we realized that there are certain things that we rely on in the content that we use to engage that student process more effectively, that we use to move students along in a transformative education approach, right? And so basically we were like, well, we need to also provide the content for the students, for teachers who want to teach this way as the foundation. And so Unraveling Assumptions is that foundation. We think about it as a primer, as something that is foundations or is basics that could be built upon in different disciplines, right? And so one of the things that is most important for us, it was actually thinking about how do you present these concepts through a basic lens of ideology that is socialized, and then through a lens of power, privilege, and oppression. So rather than just talking about identities or kind of categories or boxes, how do we consistently look at systems of oppression? And so that's really kind of what we focus on, like kind of introducing power, privilege, oppression as foundations of inequality, and then looking at the meanings and the lived experience of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, disability, and social class, kind of with an emphasis of bringing in or connecting self-reflection with conceptual knowledge, and then ending with kind of a chapter about what we can do to try to make the world a more just place, which I think is really the goal of writing both of these books.
Great. Making the world a more just place. Once you do all of the work beforehand, right? Then I think that this is... So maybe, Roxanne, I'll slide this question to you. So it sounds like if there are faculty that haven't started doing this work in their classes, but have felt called and felt concerned, they probably should start with the primer and read through that and then move to the teaching book? Or do you have sort of thoughts about for the new, or maybe they heard this and thought, you know what, I've been doing this, but I've been doing it, as I just heard you say, at the very individual level and not so much thinking about the systems work?
I think that last part is so important, doing it at the individual level and not considering systems. It's so hard when we're socialized into an educational system that prioritizes knowledge acquisition for workforce development over other ways of knowing and being. And when we don't kind of elevate our understanding and thinking and teaching from a systems perspective. So even thinking about the system of education, maybe stepping back and thinking about how that works, is not something that we're taught to do in education, and so I think you asked what to read first, and I'm going to say both simultaneously, just to be complicated, right? Because there is this way that just getting the definitions in the primer without the context, you lose so much about how to place yourself, your full self, in the educational process. And reading the relational book first without kind of the systems understanding, there's a lot lost there. So I think our approach, and we are, since y'all can't see us, we are 3 women of color psychologists who center our positionality and our context in both of these books. So we're coming at it as how do you not only create space for students' full selves in the classroom, but how do you also create space for your full self in the classroom? So you see how like everything is being moved to a systems level, to a positionality, to a contextual level. So yeah, that's a way of saying you got to buy both books and read them simultaneously.
I'm in. Sold. I just need for my other book to arrive. So maybe I'll ask Grace next, kind of a concrete example question, given what Roxanne just said. So when I read your book,
Mm-hmm.
When I think about kind of bringing my whole self, which I am not a woman of color, I'm white, super white, maybe, conscientiousness of that whiteness. What should I be thinking about then while I'm reading this? Like, what are some things that I might experience while reading the book? I'll leave it really open. I won't try to bias what you should say.
Yeah, that's a great question, Marianne. One thing that you'll find in each chapter of the teaching book is that it starts with a dialogue between the 3 of us. Mm-hmm. So, and these are conversations that we had and recorded on Zoom and then transcribed and cleaned up a little bit. But, and from there, you'll find that this is an invitation for the readers to think with us about, where you stand, what kind of socialization that you have had as a person with race, culture, and, all these other elements. And also as an educator, what kind of messages have you gotten as an educator about how to teach, right? So that's sort of what you will see. We also start the book with a letter in the beginning and at the end. So we really wanted to talk with our readers as much as possible in this way. And you will see that in each chapter, when we're talking about our examples and various things to consider, there are specific sections about, or specific paragraphs that you'll see about positionality of students and also faculty as well. So, like I said, it's an invitation to just come with us and to experience, anything that you would be thinking and feeling, and to kind of reflect on where you stand on things.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask this next question to Karen. So then for my students that are reading the book, I'm just going to take a guess of something that I think happens in this book, having not read it, which is that this is not a deficit model approach, right? So this is not about, yeah, you all can't see the head shake. Okay, good. Phew. So my question is going to make sense. But, I certainly feel like I've been socialized in a bit of that model. So this might be the first time that students are even encountering literature in which, they have real worth and value. I'm not going to borrow language. I was just at a conference for people at Catholic institutions, and the Catholic intellectual tradition is supposed to have something called Catholic imagination, which says that all human beings are valuable and give us a reflection of the grandeur of God, right? I'm guessing that's not the psychologist lens of things, but for me, that says something about who my students are in the classroom, right? And so to me, it sounds like your book is going to come more from that approach. Mm-hmm. So do you want to talk a little bit about what a student might be experiencing when they're reading this book and unpacking and trying to understand?
Sure. I mean, I think building on what Grace said, we bring our understanding that we have all been socialized into an oppressive system. And that the vast majority of our students and of professors really are bringing strong, good intentions and desires to have positive relationships and into our classrooms and into this material, right? But that is at odds with the socialization that we have, that encourages us not to see privilege, not to address injustice, to kind of tolerate things that at some level we know are not okay, right? And so just as kind of like Grace was saying in the teaching book, we're inviting teachers to think about their own socialization and what the students are bringing in. In the primer, we're directly speaking to the reader, to the students. And it may not just be the students, it may be community readers who are looking to understand these things in more depth. But we're kind of starting with the idea of you're going to have responses. And here's why. So the very first chapter starts with, like, again, a letter to our readers saying, this could be hard for you in different ways. And here's why it might be hard for you, right? And every chapter has a piece, also has a bit on like how you might respond to this and why, right? And so we're kind of bringing that in throughout. And then through reflection exercises in each chapter, encouraging people to really actively think about the ways that they have been socialized to believe certain things or to think certain ways. And do they think that is right? So it's less about kind of saying, you must believe what we're saying, right? And more about saying, why do you think the way you think? And what is the structure that you have been brought in? What is the culture that you've been brought in? What is, and what if you consider these questions from your particular position? What does that come up for you, right? And so we're presenting, conceptual information that is supported by research. But we're also kind of saying, we invite you to think about this, and we're going to prepare you for how. Great,
thank you. Roxanne, what do you think if I decide to shoot an email off after this to our faculty development leader that runs some book clubs? Is this the kind of work that would be productive in some small group discussions? Or you think that it would be better to work on a very individual level and just, note, I did my homework. I've answered the questions. Can you see some cost benefits for both? I have instincts, but you're the clinician.
I guess it depends on the context and what you have available to you. We are very much community-centered and conversation-centered, which is part of the reason why the teaching book starts the way it does, with us in conversation with each other. But I also think when you are unraveling deeply held assumptions about the world and your socialization, and you're doing it individually, it is so challenging to rise to the level of the more metacognitive level of being able to look at your socialization, because it's the current you're caught in, right? And so there is power in doing this work collectively with a social justice orientation, which means it's not an individual. It's not like you're a bad person because you think X. It is, how has socialization impacted how you see the world and what you think is right and good? And then how do you complicate that? How do you unlearn that and develop a more social justice lens where difference isn't deficit, right? But difference is diversity. And, there's diversity in humanity. And how can we kind of engage that, find love and learning in that? We talk a lot about, well, maybe not a lot, but it is a part of our ethos to think about Bell Hooks' beloved community. How do we create liberation through community? And that also includes liberation from our own learning that holds us back, to a wider lens. And so, as you can see, we're attempting to do a lot with these books. Karen once said when we were grappling with, why the hell are we writing 2 books in the middle of COVID? And we're trying to find some motivation when we're in the middle of the messy middle of the books in the slog. And she was like, I want to change the world. And Grace and I were both like, yes, of course, that's an audacious goal. And then, of course, no 2 books can unravel the centuries of socialization that exists. But I think this liberation through community, hope, right? Having hope in very, very challenging times are at the center of our motivation to write the book. And I think it also is captured, particularly in the last chapter of the primer. What do you do with this? And in teaching diversity relationally, we also talk about, how do you hold to hope when you're being faced with so much challenge and so much resistance, because people are socialized to be challenged and be very resistant to things that complicate their thinking, right? We want to live in a binary world. There's a yes and a no. Why are you making me hang out in a great place that feels uncomfortable? And so part of why we wrote the book is because we wanted to find an avenue to hope, and we wanted to hold to the audacious goal of making the world better, right? Making the world more just. And I don't know, Karen, if you know this, but I have held to those words that you said, because it really motivated me to continue with the book in a way that was positive. So thank you for that, friend.
You're welcome. Although when you say it, I'm like, wow, that sounds like a lot of hubris. Wow, that sounds like super idealistic, but it's also really true.
And it's the both and. We talk about that in the book a lot, right? How do you hold the both and? Yeah.
Thank you. So maybe I'll hop this over to Grace, and we'll go around. Because we're getting, I think, close to our sort of standard 15 to 30 minute episode length. So I'll give each of you a chance if there's something that you haven't gotten to talk about with this work or not with this work, right? What you're doing besides authoring these books that you think you would like our listeners to know about. I'll leave it pretty open for you to share. So I'll ask Grace to go first, please.
So just to clarify, Marianne, you want us to talk about our work besides the book, or do you want us to talk more about the book?
It is whatever. If people have one more minute of hearing from you, Grace, what do you want to use that for, right? It may be like, listen, these books are great, but the other things y'all really should be doing that are problematic that got axed from the chapter because it was too long.
Oh, that is so funny. Okay. No, I do want to talk about the teaching book and the developmental piece that we bring in here. So one thing that we did in the teaching book was to think about the semester, and all three of us are teaching in a semester system, as a developmental arc. So if we were to kind of pre-plan and have some ideas about around what time some issues may come up for in the classroom, that we can really plan things ahead of time. And also there are, reasons why some things may come up. So for instance, we have this like beginning arc, middle arc, ending arc, and they are subdivided into multiple chapters. But the middle arc, for instance, that's where a lot of people, including faculty and students, are feeling a lot of things, because they're learning new things, and, unlearning the socialization is really, really challenging, as we know. So that's the time when students are just really stressed. And oftentimes that's easy for faculty, or I guess not easy may not be the word, but, sometimes we think, oh, students are being resistant, right? But there are reasons why students are presenting in that way, and that is a sign that they are engaging with the information but really struggling. So we take this developmental lens in thinking about what we might be seeing. So that's something that we really sort of thought a lot about and try to link it to various psychological theories about what you may be seeing. So that's one thing that I like to highlight about the teaching book that I believe is a unique contribution that we make.
Great, thank you. Karen, I'll ask you to go next.
It's such a broad question. There's so many things we could say. Just coming back a little bit to changing the world, right? And I think we approached both of these books really through a transformative education lens. So the idea that we can use education to maintain a status quo, and we're actually really socialized into doing that most of the time. Or we can use education and be educators that aim to really consciously and proactively contribute to liberation, for ourselves, for our students, for communities, and that there's a process of critical consciousness that is part of that transformation towards justice. And so as educators, we have maybe an obligation to contribute to the development of the kind of knowledge and awareness that leads to that critical consciousness. And that it's not only a critical consciousness for white people or for privileged people. So we're not just talking about, one kind of positionality or one kind of status. So in the primer, we're talking about, sexuality, and we're talking about gender, and we're talking about disability, which does not get talked about enough. And we're talking about social class. We're talking about all of those things through the lens of privilege and oppression, right? And making connections in them. And so, and really leaning into the idea that we all have places to grow, that we all have consciousness that we need to expand. We all have knowledge that we need to deepen, right? Both conceptually and also relationally, which kind of comes back to should we read this in a faculty group? Well, given that the three of us really lean into the relationally, that interaction is so important in order to create the kind of sustained motivation and action for justice, as educators or in general.
Great. Thank you. We could have like 18 more podcast episodes on some of these concepts, right? I like that liberation is being brought in here. That was I hadn't heard that as like I recently saw a talk where that was sort of we talk a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion, but really those are supposed to be serving liberation. I was like, oh, okay, great. Next layer of this cake of justice. Thank you, Karen. Roxanne, you want to close us out?
Coming after these two brilliant women is very nerve-wracking. At base for me, I want faculty to feel seen in their struggle around teaching for social justice. I think because when things go wrong in the classroom, there is so much kind of swirling around what that means now that education for social justice is so politicized. And it can feel tenuous, right? It can feel really, as a faculty member, I feel really vulnerable in the classroom when I'm teaching this. And I'm a full professor who writes about this stuff and lives this. And it's still a tenuous, kind of vulnerable space to be in. And so I know Grace and Karen would agree, we wanted faculty who are brave enough to do this work to feel seen. Yes, we wanted to provide a pathway. Yes, we wanted to provide skills, and we wanted to do the same thing for students. We wanted students to feel seen, right? And provide a pathway to learning and liberation. But when you're doing this alone, and many of us are transgressing educational norms and socialization when we do this work, right? And so you can feel so alone. And when things blow up, it's like, I did something wrong. I am bad. I don't know what I'm doing. And it's so important to wrap what is happening in the classroom in theory, right? And in an understanding of the stages of change, and in racial identity development, and in other psychological theories, so that you're like, oh, so this is the learning. When things get ugly in the middle, this is the learning. There are ways that we say this in psychology, like grist for the mill. When things blow up in therapy, for example, you can come back, and it can make the learning stronger and the understanding stronger. So how do you prepare for that, right? If you think about the arc as Grace described, how do you prepare for the slog, the uncomfortable middle? And then what do you do about it to move from this level of hopelessness? I'm bad at it. I'm never going to be good. I should just be quiet, to more hopefulness and agency and action, right? Because none of this works if it's just a cognitive exercise. So loving that these books are in print, because then there's hope that faculty and students feel seen, right? And valued and heard, and they're given a pathway to liberation. And also that those who are transgressing their socialization in education know that there's a community of people, even if they can't experience it for themselves. They know that they're not alone. There are other people in the slog with them, which makes swimming against this cultural current easier. And that's my hope. I want people to persevere.
Cheers to perseverance. Yes. Thank you. So much gratitude to the three of you. I imagine that you hopefully are taking a time to celebrate and reflect on this work that I think really will be a treasure for educators. And thank you for pointing that out, Roxanne, right? For the people that have been doing this work for a very long time, not new to this game, and then those of us that have been coming in a little later and realizing that we might want to make some shifts. So today I have been talking with Roxanne Donovan, Grace Kim, and Karen Suyemoto about their two new books. You should read them both. You should read them together, perhaps in a community. Teaching Diversity Relationally and Unraveling Assumptions, a primer for understanding oppression and privilege. Listeners, did today's episode make you realize you have a question you would like someone to answer? I would be happy to take it into consideration and find a guest that can help. But what I need you to do is head over to our Google form at bit.ly/AskPsychSesions.